Okay, everybody, welcome to episode 2 of Health Guider, a channel that's dedicated to empowering patients to engage in their chronic health conditions. And of course, this is in collaboration with their healthcare providers. Now, it's Health Guider, or my philosophy, that for a patient to successfully engage and have the best results in their chronic health conditions, they need to start thinking about their health and their healthcare, and more specifically, critically think. So as I was going through my journey as to become a better critical thinker, I came across a book by our guest, Jonathan Haber, Critical Thinking. It just came out. It is part of the MIT Press Essential Knowledge. And so without further ado, Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Great. And just so our audience know, I mean, you have dedicated a significant part of your life to critical thinking. You're an educator, you're a researcher, an entrepreneur in the critical thinking space. And you've published several books, a book called Critical Voter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Using the critical thinking skills to vote effectively. Mm-hmm. And your work has also been published on the Wall Street Journal, Boston Globe. So thank you again. It's a huge honor for you to join us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And I should mention that Critical Voter book is more of a how-to book on how to learn critical thinking skills. It happens to use election politics, but it's really a sort of general purpose how-to. And a new edition has just come out last week, so in time for the 2020 election.
Perfect. And it's available on Amazon?
It is available on Amazon, yep.
Okay. I'll leave notes in the information section, okay, to both books. So Jonathan, in your estimation, how long do you think humans have been critically thinking?
Well, to sort of, the answer to that is going to be speculative, right? The sort of discussions, the scientific discussions on the topic come out of evolutionary psychology, which has been examining how our thought processes might have evolved, similarly how our physical attributes have evolved over time. But of course, there's no archaeological artifacts of thinking processes, and until kind of writing emerged, which is quite recently, there's no records of how people thought. So we have to speculate, but I mean, there's some interesting kind of speculations going on. And by speculation, I mean, inductive reasoning, the same kind of reasoning we use to speculate on things we can't sense with our senses, like, the quantum sphere or the origins of the universe. But there's some theories, the Sperber theory, which came out maybe 5-10 years ago, claims that we developed our critical reasoning ability not to get to the truth, but in order to better persuade others to follow us. Mm-hmm. And so therefore that had evolutionary benefit, because it would allow us to form larger groups and survive if we were able to sort of convince people to do what we wanted to. But of course, there's no way of confirming that, but it's an interesting theory. I think one aspect which I think is probably on pretty sounder ground is how some of the biases that we are impacted by may have evolutionary origins. The most obvious one being confirmation bias, which is the bias that gets you to accept information that confirms with what you already believe and reject information that doesn't comply with what you already believe. Now, if you think evolutionarily, that could have led people to, for instance, jump to conclusions, right? When you hear a rustle in the bushes, you could either stop and speculate, what might that be, or you can run. And I think there's an obvious evolutionary benefit to running and not contemplating, because the cost is so high if you're wrong. Now, that bias is now harming us because we are not at that same evolutionary stage. We're at a stage when believing what we already believe can harm us. It prevents us from getting to the truth. In fact, I would say, that's one of the most pernicious biases that's impacting the world today. So I think there's things that are wired into our system, certainly the ability to develop reasoning skills, but also flaws in our reasoning are probably also hardwired into our brains.
Yeah. Is bias, bias has a lot of negative connotation. I find that to have a bias, I almost feel guilty to have a bias about something. Can biases lead to positive outcomes?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, one can be biased towards, um, one could be biased towards, for instance, trusting professionals, right?
Yeah.
That's a bias that might get you into trouble now and then, but it's a perfectly reasonable bias. So biases aren't all harmful. I think more importantly, we shouldn't treat them as character flaws. We are all susceptible to certain biases, cognitive biases, by the sheer fact that we're human beings, right? So for example, if I were to ask you how many of each animal did Moses bring on the ark, you would answer
Two.
two, as most people would, even though Moses had no ark. It was
Yeah.
Noah who had the ark, right?
Oh, okay.
That's a
Okay.
cognitive illusion, right? And you're a
Yeah.
doctor,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it shouldn't have worked on you, but it does. I
Yeah.
played that same trick on college professors, on priests. These are
Yeah.
flaws in our reasoning. They're like optical illusions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so therefore, when we are prey to them, we should not consider them character flaws, but we should be aware of them. We should understand just by dint of being humans, there are things that there are imperfections in our reasoning that we at least need to be aware of and control for.
Yeah. Do you think, at least let's say, would it be accurate, reasonable to say that modern humans have been reasoning for at least 10 to 15,000 years since the agricultural revolution?
Certainly, I think there's certainly the ability to master fire
Hmm.
or agriculture means there's certain cognitive functions that needed to be in place. And then there's a sort of evolutionary progression, right? The more that you use fire to cook your food, the less energy it takes to digest it. The more you can grow your own food versus gathering it, the more evolution will favor the sort of continual progression of development of your faculties for reasoning. So I think there's sort of an acceleration process going on. But I would say also when it comes to critical thinking, there is, to a certain sense, an unnatural aspect to it. It requires you to think in a structured way, to follow things other than intuition. So I would say, really, the sort of intellectual explosions that took place really around the world around 2,500 years ago. Here in the West, we think of it as ancient Athens, the sort of philosophy of Athens, but that was around the same time you had similar Confucian philosophy kind of growing in China. You had similar kind of metaphysics expanding in India. It's not exactly clear why this all happened in the same period of time, but it was moving people from following their sort of instincts and intuitions to thinking in new ways, thinking in sort of complex new ways. And I think that is really the sort of birth, certainly the birth of both Eastern and Western sort of philosophy, but also the birth of what eventually became known as critical thinking.
So as you were going through learning about the different characters and the different philosophies, um, have you collected a Mount Rushmore of critical thinkers or a NBA All-Star team of critical thinkers?
Well, if I had to kind of carve, if I had a choice of just four faces on Rushmore, I'm sort of a product of Western philosophy. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, I would guess, would get the first three slots. I think particularly Aristotle, who systematized logic, systematized rhetoric, systematized sort of all of what became science. So not that Socrates and Plato didn't also open up enormous vistas, particularly in the areas of deductive reasoning, but they're really the sort of cornerstone of a philosophical tradition that led to what I refer to as the critical thinker's toolkit. Logic, um, language skills, communication skills, etc. And I guess if I would put that fourth slot, I would put John Dewey, who was probably the most prominent American intellectual of the 20th century, particularly well known in education circles as the sort of father of progressive education models. But he also created the concept of critical thinking. Critical thinking actually has an origin point. It's 1910 when Dewey wrote a book called How We Think. He was a fervent advocate of democracy, almost religious believer in the superiority of democracy. But he understood that democratic citizens had obligations to think through the issues that they face and the decisions they have to make, and how we think spelled out exactly what democratic citizens should be able to do. And what he spelled out, he referred to it as reflective thinking, but that eventually morphed into what we refer to as critical thinking. So if you want the sort of father of critical thinking, I would say kind of Dewey would get that fourth slot on Mount Rushmore.
So as you were learning about these individuals, um, what made them so special? Why? What was it about their disposition or their journey that led them to be so influential in these areas?
I think, like many philosophers, they're dedicated to thinking in new ways, thinking in ways that have never been tried before. You know, in the case of Socrates, the notion that the world is not simply what we perceive. What we perceive might be merely a poor reflection of the real world, the world of the forms, right? That was an enormous intellectual breakthrough. Um, that was a change that kind of transformed the world ever since. You know, Aristotle with the notion of thinking what we now refer to as inductively, but by looking at patterns, you know, looking at birds and sort of determining that they fall in different categories, looking at the sciences and citing that there's different categories of science, looking at information. So, you know, again, he's sort of thinking in whole new ways. You know,
Yeah.
Dewey was not quite so groundbreaking, but he was certainly groundbreaking as a philosopher to get us thinking about ourselves as human beings, as thinking beings in completely different ways. But, you know, there's other people who are vitally important that
Mm-hmm.
I kind of admire as critical thinkers, who aren't often sort of thought of as critical thinkers. I mean, certainly, you know, geniuses like Albert Einstein, but also sort of great sort of political and moral leaders like Martin Luther King or Gandhi. You know, they're considered great moral leaders. They have kind of a reputation in particularly King and Gandhi and sort of for their religious faith. But if you kind of look at what they achieved, they really understood human nature,
Yeah.
and they really understood persuasive language,
Yeah.
and they were able to harness that understanding to achieve a goal. So in many ways, I consider their success to have been a result of their skill as critical thinkers.
Yeah, yeah, and I like if there's a tagline for critical thinking, I think Gandhi's book, My Experimentations with the Truth, or I think My Experiments with the Truth, I think would be a nice way to encapsulate, at least for me, the philosophy of critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
As you were going through your journey, what were some aha moments? What did you feel? Well, or let me put it to you a different way. Did you have a moment where you blinked your head and said, "Oh, I can't believe it was this simple all along"? Just a small tweak in your view.
You know, I'd say it was not a sort of immediate aha moment, but you know, my journey actually began. The Critical Voter book was sort of the end result of an 8-year journey. That in 2008, I was in a partisan household. There was an election going on. You know, generally everybody in the family agreed with who we were going to vote for. But I noticed my kids, who were young at the time, were behaving really rudely about the opposition candidates, right? They were like talking about them in ways we would never tolerate them talking about adults so disrespectfully, right? And it dawned on me, well, where do they pick up this, you know, behavior? They obviously picked it up from us, from me, right? That's how we behaved as partisans. So I decided in 2008 I would sort of model for them that they could keep an open mind and still make, you know, sort of sound decisions by being an undecided voter,
Yeah,
right? So I blogged as an undecided voter, and it was, you know, my family was bemused by it somewhat, but I think I did notice my kids kind of open their minds some. They were the notion that you can have strong opinions without being disrespectful, much less hating or loathing the opposition. So over the next several years, I kind of developed that concept into what became the critical voter curriculum, where I devised sort of what fell into the category of critical thinking, what skills, logic, communication skills, information literacy, many things that we'll be sort of talking about. on that. And my first kind of test subjects were my own kids, those kids who were kind of my motivation in 2008. And so over the next several years, I kind of moved from just sort of keeping an open mind to actually having a sort of full-blown kind of curriculum for being a critical thinker, which also included understanding that keeping an open mind is a vital component of critical thinking. It's a critical thinking disposition. So really, I would say it was over that course of time, I realized, oh, when I'm keeping an open mind, I'm thinking differently. What is it about this thinking process? And then systematizing it, learning about how critical thinking is taught. Obviously, a lot of these techniques are nothing I invented. I'm just sort of was pulling them together and teaching them possibly in a new way. But I would say that was my journey. And the journey is still sort of underway.
Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, but would open-mindedness be effectively the foundation of critical thinking, point zero?
Well, you got to remember, like critical thinking falls into three categories, right? There's knowledge. You need to understand some system of logic, have some knowledge of how to turn everyday communication into structured arguments, et cetera. But then you have to be skilled at doing that, right? You have to be able to do that in different situations with different editorials, different speeches. But then you have to want to do it, right? You have to want to do it, even in situations where you might be more inclined to just go with your gut, for example, or do what you're told. So open-mindedness should be considered a disposition. And it certainly would be a starting point, but it's also woven so tightly in with knowledge and skills, right? If you know logic inside and out, and you're really, really good at dissecting arguments, but you're very close-minded, so you're only ever good to dissect arguments you disagree with, never subject your own opinions to scrutiny, then you're probably not a critical thinker. So I'd say, yes, it is terrific if you kind of enter this project as open-minded, but I think also by becoming a critical thinker, you realize the benefits of open-mindedness, right? The ability to sort of deal with the fact that you might not know everything and you could make mistakes if you believe you do.
Yeah. And so I think that's what we are trying to empower patients with that health guider, is the fact that in order to get the best results for your chronic health condition, you need to become as engaged as your provider is. And it should be this dance where, I like this quote where the physician is the master of the disease, but the patient is the master of symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is there should be this dance between the physician and the patient as to guide the course of treatment. But the only way that can occur is if the patient starts to critically think about themselves, how they're contributing to the disease, and start learning about the disease and how they can leverage the products and services that are available to them. Mm-hmm. But you need to start being a critical thinker because there is a huge amount of knowledge out there. And so that's where I'd like to start, perhaps teaching the patient. So I'm going to read a quote that I've paraphrased from your book. And it says, the tools and methods you use to understand and analyze arguments are so diverse that there's no right or wrong choice regarding which system you use or invent. The only option not on the table is to leave the thinking unorganized. So what does that mean in the setting of a patient?
I think there's many ways to think about a problem, right? There's many ways to come to understanding or beliefs about, say, your condition or medical treatments, right? One is we call an a priori approach to thinking, where you just believe what you've always believed, right? You fall back on your biases, your assumptions about medicine, about your doctor, about your own sort of physical state, your own health. So that's one unproductive way of believing. You could also make decisions through authority, right? I could just do whatever you tell me, right? You're my doctor, tell me what to do and I'll do that, right? That is also not particularly productive because, as you said, it's a sort of two-way street. I could defy authority, right? I could say, you're not telling me how to live. I'm going to do what I want. That's called tenacity. So these are kind of, and Dewey sort of was somebody whose philosophy grew out of an understanding that those three ways of thinking, a priori, authority, and tenacity, they have their place, but they're not particularly good at getting close to the truth. To get to the truth, you want to be a critical thinker. You want to approach questions scientifically, if sort of scientific method is useful, but you want to approach it systematically. And in that quote, that was referring to logic, right? You could think logically using informal logic, which is a very simple logical system that most people can understand, or you could use a graphical system of logic, which is often good for young learners, or you could use a very sophisticated form of logic, and that's what doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that you are approaching your problem or your question through some form of logic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And okay, so let's start trying to build a very simple toolbox for patients to start using. I guess my first question is, do you have 2 or 3 favorite questions that you go to that seem to be multi-purpose? So, for example, what I'm saying is that it is my understanding that one of the tools that a critical thinker uses is asking the right questions.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so I was just wondering, in your journey, have you come across a few powerful questions that can be used in various situations?
I think, the things you should approach a problem from a critical thinking perspective. First one is, am I bringing any biases to the table that could impact my judgment? Okay, so that's the first question you should ask yourself. Is there anything I tend to believe or any experiences I've had that may cause me to approach this issue too narrowly or too broadly or in a way that might make it a challenge to get to the truth? That's the first question to ask that of yourself. I think, the second question is, what do I know? Okay, what facts do I have? What evidence do I have? What is lacking? This gets into the area of background knowledge, which is a key critical thinking principle, right? It doesn't matter how good at logic you are if you don't know what you're talking about. That means your evidence, the premises of your argument are going to be flawed. I guess the third is when it comes down to a decision, is there a way to kind of structure my decision in the form of a logical argument, right? Because if it's in the form of a logical argument, then I can analyze it using the tools of critical thinking, right? I could determine, is this argument valid? Is it sound? Is it strong? Is it weak? So I'd say, but often before you get to the point of having a logical argument, you first have to sort of check yourself, which is kind of check your biases and check your understanding. What's the data? I think often people look at just the middle part, right? They just jump right to the web, start Googling whatever condition they have, and they're not really sort of critically analyzing the sources of the data, the quality of the data, the relevance of the data. In other words, they're not using good information literacy principles to provide them the background knowledge to get started. And then they'll often, if people jump to a conclusion, right, they may prefer a remedy that's actually controversial or not as well documented as other alternatives because they see a commercial, on the news for it, or they get to a website that's sort of singing its praises without sort of understanding some of the downsides of it, those kind of things. So I'd say, bias and knowledge are core critical thinking concepts that I think is often missed when people just assume this is about gathering facts. It's not just about facts. It's about how you use that facts to come to an understanding or a belief.
Okay, so I'm going to maybe translate that into what I see day in and day out. So the first step is obviously asking yourself, what biases am I bringing to this situation? And I think the most common biases that I see in patients are a few. So you have patients that are highly skeptical, about anything in healthcare, health and healthcare. So
Mhm.
that is a bias, almost bordering conspiracy theories that
Mhm.
big pharma's out to get you. Doctors are, in bed with big pharmas. Medications are, the rabbit hole
Mhm.
can go on and on. Sorry. So that's one bias. But then the other bias is also that almost a paternalistic bias that your provider knows everything and is
Mhm.
making the best decision for you. So I think as a patient, perhaps these are the two biases. Obviously, there are going to be several in between and ones
Mhm.
that I haven't even come across. But I would say the majority of patients either fall into the skeptical conspiracy theorists and
Mhm.
reject all form of treatment, or they think that all allopathic, all pharmaceutical or traditional pharmaceutical products and services are uh, full of side effects and that only alternative medicine is the way to go. Or you have the population that has completely relinquished control to their provider,
Mhm.
and that may not also be very beneficial. So these are the three biases that I think a patient can ask themselves. Am I skeptical? Have I completely rejected traditional allopathic medicine and only biased towards alternative? Or have I completely relinquished all control
Mhm.
to my provider, assuming that they know everything?
Mhm.
I
And now
think
you have a vocabulary to describe that, right? The first is, or the, you know, turning to the provider and assuming they know everything, that's authority, right?
authority.
That's you turning to authority to form your beliefs, and rejecting authority because it's in bed with big pharma, or there's other sort of natural treatments as opposed to kind of pharmaceutical treatments. That's tenacity, right? That's neither of those are about sort of reaching your own conclusion after examining the facts logically. It's forming beliefs through methods that, again, they have their place, but they're not particularly good at getting to the truth.
Perfect. So once a patient identifies whether they lean more towards tenacity or authoritarian, the next step when either learning about a condition or making a decision is to get the highest quality data to build that foundation of knowledge. And that's where the concept of information literacy, which is
Mm-hmm.
not just specific to healthcare, but across all domains. And could
Mm-hmm.
you talk a little bit more about what information literacy is, and perhaps during our pandemic is the most perfect time to illustrate why it is such a critical skill moving forward?
Absolutely, yeah. No, information literacy grew out of the library field actually in the 70s as libraries were reinventing themselves as sort of information specialists versus just book and document collectors. They created the field of information literacy to deal with these new sources of information that were entering the library first, right? You know, like databases that can only be afforded by academic or in some cases public libraries. And then eventually that with the advent of the internet, the skills that they determined that they called information literacy became universally applicable.
Yeah,
And some of them are research skills, search skills. How do you find the best information, but also how do you evaluate the best information? So it's location, evaluation, and then some of the things you're evaluating for is not just accuracy and bias; those are both important, but also timeliness, reliability, and very importantly, sufficiency, right? There's so much information out there, right? You could go down a rabbit hole and never emerge. So you have to start the process with a question in mind, and you will know you've achieved sufficient information when you're able to answer that question intelligently. And this
perfect,
is
perfect,
applicable, as you said, across all domains.
perfect. And so I guess the questions that an individual can use during this stage is the information that I am using accurate and reliable? I think that would be a simple set of questions that they could ask.
That's a good start. I would say, um, a good idea on any sort of information quest, because remember, you're developing your background knowledge, which is a cornerstone critical thinking skill. Um, if you want to start by asking the right question, right? for instance, you could say, I'm going to start by asking the question, is this medication my doctor suggested dangerous?
Yeah, well,
Right?
yeah.
And that's going to send you down a search that will probably give you answers to that question, but it might not have been the right question, right? You might have wanted to ask, what are the alternative medications for my condition? That might have been a sort of better initial question, and that would trigger a different search. So it's your questioning shouldn't just be, questioning of your sources. That's part of the process, but you want to make sure you're on the right road to begin with.
Right. Right. So 3 steps, as you had meant. Number 1 was checking for your own biases, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trying to identify, are you tenacious and somewhat anti-authoritarian? Would that be a fair statement?
Mm-hmm.
Or you are authoritarian and kind of just assume the information that you've been told. Now, like anything in life, there's pros and cons for each side.
Mm-hmm.
As you have identified which side that you lean on, you then go to establishing a base of knowledge in that specific domain, right? It's very important to realize just because you're a master, you spend years studying diabetes doesn't mean that you could probably comment on the Venus flytrap at a botany conference.
Mm-hmm.
I just say that because we have a Venus flytrap in our house.
Okay. Where that came from.
So then, and using, as you go on that expedition to build that foundation, you have to be mindful and just ask yourself, is the information that I'm building my foundation on from a credible source and somewhat neutral, right? You want to be you want to look at both sides. And then you go on to the next stage where you are taking all of this information at the beginning of the process and then synthesizing it to making a decision. And so that you had said that constructing an argument, is that correct?
Right. I mean, chances are, as you kind of go down this path, you'll amass a lot of facts, you'll get a lot of data, but you are ultimately going to be presented with one or more arguments, right? Your doctor may try to convince you that a certain treatment is the way to go, or you may read articles or testimonials from people who've used one treatment or the other, right? Those are arguments, okay? And I think one of the reasons this is so critical is that a lot of people have sort of fallen in the trap of thinking it's all about facts, right? I deal with this a lot in the political realm because what do we do with the news? We check the facts, right? We check the facts. Is the facts accurate? If the facts are accurate, it's sort of clear to hurdle. But point of fact, more often than not, facts may be marshaled to convince you of something that's false. Okay, that happens all the time. And that's because we have failed to recognize that in addition to facts, there's something that connects those set of facts to a conclusion. Okay, that is reasons for belief. So I would say this is very important for patients is to understand, they have to understand not just the data, not just the facts, but the reasons that those facts convince them to do X, Y, or Z, right? They have to understand the reasons. They have to be able to articulate not just the facts, but the reasons that lead to the conclusion. And once you have that, then you could sort of analyze not just the quality of the facts, but you could end up with all true facts leading to a terrible decision or a false conclusion. So you have to really be very cognizant of the fact that reasons to believe something, that's real. That's just as real and concrete as facts that can be proven true or false.
Okay. So one of the most powerful things that I learned in your book was structuring an argument into, say, the conclusion and then the premises, right? Going through a body of information and segregating it into conclusions. So what the author is trying to get me to believe as true, and then further scrutinizing the information as to the reasons why they want me to believe that, and that is called a premise. Is that correct?
The premises is your evidence, and the reasons to believe something, that's referred to as a warrant in logical argumentation. But it probably best to illustrate this with an example, right?
Yeah,
A
exactly.
simple example I use all the time during the time of COVID. Somebody says, we've been locked down for 6 months and the deaths are still going up. So obviously social distancing is a failure. Okay, that's an argument, right? And if you look at that, that argument has two premises. We have been in lockdown for 6 months. We've been socially isolated for 6 months. And the second premise is during the 6 months, the number of deaths has gone up. So the conclusion is social distancing has failed, right? Well, you could fact check that argument, but the premises are true, right? We have been locked down for 6 months. Deaths have gone up. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with the premises. Okay,
With
so
the
you now have
facts.
to,
So those are the
the
facts.
facts, the fact checking, you could fact check it all day long.
Yeah.
The facts check out, right? We've been locked down.
In isolation, those facts are true.
Those facts are true. And so therefore, if you are going to reject the notion that social distancing is a failure, you can't do it by checking the facts, right? The facts are all true. Okay, so the way you do that in the course of our argumentation is 101 in formal argumentation is you accept the facts, you accept the premises, which in this case it's easy because the premises are true, but even if you doubt the premises, accept them anyway, and then see if you could still reject the conclusion. If you can, then the argument is invalid and the argument fails. In this case, it's easy to accept the premises because they're true, which is determined, okay, but then also reject the conclusion, right? Because why? We have background knowledge. We know isolation was not meant to eliminate COVID entirely. It was meant to flatten the curve, so we didn't have so many cases that overwhelmed the healthcare system. In fact, flattening the curve implies it could take even longer to kind of work COVID out of our system, right? So with that knowledge, I understand I could accept the premises, but still easily reject the conclusion. Therefore, the argument is invalid, it fails. Not because it's factually incorrect, but because it is logically invalid. So that's a non-intuitive thing that we have Aristotle to thank for. This is something that even today people will zero on the premises. If they see one that's false, they'll reject the whole argument, which is somewhat understandable, but it's still useful to go through the whole logic checking process. This is what I do with the news. I've got a site called Logic Check that's sort of analyzing the news of the day through these kind of processes. It's worth going through the whole process because then you'll have grounded your decision in not just sound evidence, but logical strength.
No, I actually really like your website. It's logiccheck.net, and I'll put that down in the information box as well. Mm-hmm. So I guess, Jonathan, let's take all of this information that we've discussed and let's model it for our audience or patients that require some guidance on how to respectfully collaborate with their providers to achieve the best outcome. How does that sound to you?
Let's go for it.
Okay. Well, Jonathan, unfortunately, despite all your years of thinking about thinking, you have not been able to outthink diabetes. Okay, I'm sorry to say, but your yearly checkup came back with a hemoglobin A1C, or the marker that we use to diagnose diabetes, as elevated, more specifically 8.5. So to make things much more simpler, when we check for diabetes and we get this lab result of more than 6.5, we generally say that this person has now developed the disease of diabetes, okay? And you are at 8.5. So first of all, how does that make you feel?
I'm a little in shock, actually. I thought I was healthy. I thought it was healthy. I mean, does it mean I'm going to be injecting insulin for the rest of my life? I don't know anything about, I've known people with diabetes, but I can't say I've ever really thought about it for myself.
Okay, well, I mean, no, that's very important. At least let me at least create a base of knowledge for you to start working. So a few things. Do you have an understanding of what diabetes is?
I know it has to do with blood sugar and the body's inability to produce insulin. I think that's
Yeah, so
what I know.
that's a very good starting point. It's a little more complex than that. So yes, it's the body's inability to utilize sugar well, sugar being the main packet of energy that we use to just get through the day. And how the body is failing to manage that sugar is complex. But I think a very basic foundation for you to understand is that your body isn't utilizing the sugar as well as it should. Okay. Um, if there are more information that you want to learn about diabetes, I can give you a number of websites. Okay. But generally stick to websites that end with .gov, because these are generally government verified websites that will help with your education. Okay, so that's number one. That's the underlying principle of diabetes, the inability to utilize your sugar. The second question is, it is a chronic condition, right? So what that means is that if we don't adhere to the recognized lifestyle changes and perhaps medications, diabetes will continue, right? Your inability to utilize the sugars will continue. However, there are several things that you can do to reverse diabetes, okay? And we'll discuss that a little later on. And the third thing is there are several types of diabetes. The diabetes that you have, or it's called type 2 diabetes, does not require insulin, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So does that make sense, what I'm describing so far?
It does. It does. So I won't be injecting insulin. Will I be
No,
injecting something else?
no. So as of right now, if we stay on top of things and we discuss how to move forward, I suspect that you will not need to inject anything. Okay. However, I will say that if we don't do our due diligence, over the years, you could end up needing insulin and injections.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the way we approach diabetes is typically in somebody at your range is we start a medication, right? A
Mm-hmm.
medication that helps us uh, bring back the natural order of sugar production and sugar utilization in the body. And so the medication I recommend to you is metformin.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard about
Metformin.
metformin?
No, not.
Okay. Generally, metformin is the medication that we use for newly diagnosed diabetics, but that is just one dimension of care. The biggest bang for your buck is how we have to start reviewing your diet and your physical activity to start changing all the factors that have been known to help your diabetes. Okay,
Okay.
so that's a lot
Okay.
of information.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to need some time to think about it and do some research. So I appreciate your kind of pointing me in the right direction. And then if we can have a follow-up conversation before I make any decisions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Take your time. Um, I would say that as you go through your journey of learning more about diabetes and the different options, please be very mindful of the data sources that you use. So again, generally stay to .gov websites, okay,
Mm-hmm.
GOV. The American Diabetes Association is another good resource.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you want to pursue any academic literature, two databases called PubMed, P-U-B-M-E-D,
Okay.
or Cochrane,
Mm-hmm.
Cochrane. So use those databases to get perhaps the highest quality, most credible information to inform your decision, okay?
Okay. Okay.
Okay,
Okay. We'll talk again.
no problem. So lucky for me, Jonathan, you've come back and you're eager to talk again.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's discuss, what did you learn?
Okay. Well, just be a little meta for a second. The steps that I have taken or I would recommend people take are the ones we just talked about before. First, I would check my biases, right? And I think just personally, I'm probably a little bit further to the authority side on not just medicine, but I trust my doctors, I trust my lawyers, I trust finance people. So I have a tendency to accept the kind of word of authority figures, generally doctors in particular, and probably a bias towards kind of scientific pharmaceutical medicine. And this is an example, for example, that this is not necessarily a bad bias, right? I mean, imagine you and other doctors watching this said, I wish that more people had that bias, but it is a bias. It means if there are some alternatives that might fall outside of that category of classical Western medicine, scientific medicine, I might be resistant to them. And so I should keep an open mind. So for example, if after I told friends and family, I've got this diagnosis, somebody came along and said, oh, have you thought about fenugreek, right? My first instinct would be, that's some quack, you know, uh, new age medicine. Don't talk to me about, fenugreek. I want to talk about sort of, medications that have gone through, sort of multi-stage, multi-billion-dollar tests. But point of fact, diabetes has a whole dietary component to it that has nothing to do with scientific medicine, and whether or not fenugreek is sort of part of a dietary component of my treatment, I should be open to things other than pharmaceuticals, for all kinds of reasons. So therefore, I need to control my own biases, which are geared towards, have the doctor tell me what to do and give me a pill so that I could solve this problem, because there will be a component of the solution that's going to involve behavioral change on my part. I also have to be ready to accept my own sort of challenges, changing behaviors. That I understand this is going to probably have to do with change with diet, change with exercise. I have my own sort of abilities and inabilities to sort of like perform routine maintenance, which I have to kind of appreciate and not cover up when I'm having these conversations, and possibly other medical concerns. So those are the biases to overcome. So I keep an open mind. Then there's the background knowledge stage, which you've pointed me towards appropriate websites. I think the getting back to the questioning, right? You mentioned that I should look at metformin. My friend told me I should look at fenugreek, right? So, but the first thing I should do is not sit down to Google metformin versus fenugreek, right? That's, I mean, I'll probably get results because you get results of anything, but it's really not about either of those treatments per se, right? I need to understand what it means to have diabetes. I need to understand what it means for somebody of my age and my profile to have diabetes, what the alternative treatments are. And then within that, I can then understand what's the role of medicines, what's metformin all about, what's the role of diet, where does is fenugreek a sort of dietary component? Is it a sort of proven or unproven alternative to medication? But by then I've already understood what diabetes is, what it means to have it, and what some of the alternatives are. So now I've got sort of biases controlled for, or at least accounted for and checked. I've got the background information that's been channeled in the right direction. Now I'm ready to have a conversation with you. And in that conversation, I would expect you will try to convince me of, one or two paths. And in so doing, you will construct arguments that I, as a critical thinker, will be able to determine, well, what are the premises of those arguments, and do those premises support the conclusion that my doctor is trying to convince me? Okay, so those are the steps of, I would say, a critical thinking patient.
Yeah, and I think actually I'll take a moment to be a critical thinking physician as well. Mm-hmm. So if I was to follow that path, okay, number one, because I'm more open-minded, or just to say I am open-minded, I have controlled for the bias that initially I had thought alternative medicines were not really proven, right? Mm-hmm. But just because they're not proven doesn't mean that they could not work. It just means that time, energy, and resources have not been invested into highly elegant and sophisticated research.
Mm-hmm.
So I've controlled for the bias that just because it hasn't been scientifically proven doesn't mean that it doesn't have some value
Mm-hmm.
if controlled for its risk profile. So that's
Mm-hmm.
my bias, that I'm going to, naturally I tend to reject alternative medicines. However, I can go by case to determine the risk profile. Then I will go on to building a foundation of knowledge. Now, fenugreek actually comes up quite often in my practice. And so I've already done the due diligence of using high quality databases to determine what the evidence suggests about fenugreek.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I can tell, there are quite a number of research articles, right, about fenugreek, generally published in journals that are pro-alternative medicine, pro-Ayurvedic medicine, pro-nutrition, rather than, say, the specific heart journals like the Journal of American Cardiology or something.
Mm-hmm.
Or diabetes. So what I can determine from high quality sources is that fenugreek possibly has positive outcomes when used in patients with diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I spent some time on determining its risk profile.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that fenugreek actually doesn't have a lot of risks associated with it, right? So then I go on to creating an argument that perhaps my argument is that, you know what, Jonathan, because fenugreek has a low risk profile, I would suggest that if you are so inclined, you can use fenugreek in addition to metformin. And if there's any positive outcome that you achieve with fenugreek, great. But I think it would be a good move for you simply because the downside is very low. So is that kind of how a critically
Sure.
thinking patient-doctor encounter would go?
And if we want to sort of like map this out for your listeners, viewers, you've constructed an argument, right? You have quite a good one, actually. You've got evidence that certainly, metformin has evidence behind it. We could presume I also researched that and saw that it is a medicine that has gone through the process and is generally considered acceptable with known side effects to control this disease. You've also indicated that fenugreek is not nonsense or toxic, right? But that it is, you've established it doesn't have the pedigree of a metformin in terms of the research base, but you've also been open-minded about it, right? You haven't dismissed it out of hand. And what's your conclusion is that you should go on metformin, but if you want to do fenugreek also, that's a safe thing to do. So you've left me with basically the choice of just go with metformin or go with metformin and fenugreek. You're trying to convince me that just using fenugreek would be a bad choice. Okay, so but your argument, one of the reasons it's a quality argument is you've not dismissed fenugreek as out of hand, but you have asked me to not use it as my exclusive treatment method.
Yeah.
And so therefore I can accept your premises. Metformin is good, fenugreek is less proven, but could help and is not necessarily like bad for you. Therefore I should go on both if I want to, or at least go on metformin. And that's, a valid argument, right? That's an argument that I could accept the conclusion of premises and still it's very hard for me to reject the conclusion.
Perfect. So again, I just want the audience to know that I guess the essence of this podcast and what Jonathan and I just went through was it's all about collaborating with your provider, two minds, two critically thinking minds coming together to achieve the best outcome. Would you agree with that, Jonathan?
Yeah, and I should extend it. This is something that could be used not just in medicine, but across life, across all the decisions you're making. And, you've seen, one reason I love this exercise of doing kind of a modeling a real kind of treatment conversation was you could see this is not necessarily natural, right? Our instincts are not to immediately step back and, understand our biases, right? Our instinct is to wallow in our biases, or just, treat them like they're true, the things we believe are true. Questioning, your own sort of beliefs that might distort judgment is not natural. Performing research in a way that's there to gather a wide amount of information and then sort of analyze. Again, that's a skill that takes time. And then arguing something out, right? Sort of these are things that take skill or take experience, take knowledge of the skill set, but are totally worth it.
Yeah.
You're going to end up with better healthcare. You'll end up with, better decisions in life. You'll end up with better relationships, a more successful career. So I really recommend the way of critical thinking is takes some getting used to,
Yeah.
but it's not that hard. It takes some time to get good at it. It's not that hard. I mean, you've learned medicine, you've learned a subject 100 times more voluminous than critical thinking, but it's totally worth it for all kinds of reasons. And I really appreciate the chance to kind of go through this with you. So thank you very much. Thanks again for having me on.
No, perfect. Thank you. And where can our audience reach you?
You can reach me at jonathan@degreeoffreedom.org. I'll send you the a link to that, as well as, I've got a website called jonathanhaber.org, JONATHNHABER.org, that's got links to all the kind of various properties that you can learn more about critical thinking. So, and please, clearly I love talking about this stuff. So
Yeah.
anybody watching this who wants to talk more, eager to talk about this stuff as much as anybody likes.
Perfect, Jonathan. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, and good luck with your mission.